When Renata Solis stepped out of that blacked-out SUV and knocked on the door of apartment 4B, nobody on Fenwick Street knew she was worth $2.4 billion. Not the neighbors who watched through cracked blinds, whispering about the woman in the tailored coat who had no business being in a building like this one. Not the super who nearly dropped his toolbox at the sight of her. And certainly not Luca Ferrante, the single father on the other side of that door, flour on his hands from making his daughter's birthday cake, still wearing yesterday's exhaustion like a second shirt, who opened it and looked at her like she was a mistake. She wasn't. She had come with a purpose, and what she said in the next 30 seconds would leave him unable to speak, unable to breathe, unable to pretend that his life was still the ordinary, quietly painful thing he had made his peace with. This is their story. If you're watching from anywhere in the world right now, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. And if what you're about to hear moves something in you, hit that like button. You'll understand why by the end. Now let me take you back to where it really started. Not to the knock, not to the SUV, but to a Tuesday morning 3 weeks earlier, the kind of morning that looked like every other morning Luca had survived since his world fell apart. The building on Fenwick Street was the kind that cities forget on purpose. 5 stories of water-stained concrete, a front door that hadn't locked properly since March, a hallway that smelled like cigarette smoke and damp laundry, and something else underneath it. Something that Luca had decided long ago to call survival, because calling it anything else was too heavy to carry. He'd moved here 18 months ago with 2 duffel bags, his daughter Pia, and absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. Luca Ferrante was 39 years old. He worked the early shift at a distribution warehouse 3 miles away, in by 5, out by 2, just enough time to pick Pia up from school and get back before dark. He was not a man who complained. He was not a man who asked for things. He was the kind of man who quietly fixed what was broken, said thank you when he didn't have to, and folded his grief into the back corners of himself so that Pia never had to see the shape of it. He had been doing this for 2 years, 4 months, and 9 days. Not that he was counting. He woke every morning at 4:45 before the alarm, the way people do when they're always slightly afraid of being late. He made coffee in a machine with a cracked handle that he kept meaning to replace. He laid out Pia's school uniform the night before, so mornings didn't involve decisions neither of them had energy for. He braided her hair badly, and she told him every day, laughing. It was their thing. He didn't know that a woman was watching his building. He didn't know that the same black SUV had been parked at the far end of Fenwick Street for 3 days. He didn't know that the name on the spine of the report sitting in that SUV, the one on the seat beside the woman who could buy his entire block without flinching, was his. He was just making coffee, and wishing the cracked machine was quieter. And thinking about his daughter's birthday, still 3 weeks away, and how much a second-hand bicycle cost, and whether he could make the numbers move if he picked up a Saturday shift. That was Luca Ferrante's whole world. And then Renata Solis got out of her car and walked toward his door. The alarm on Luca Ferrante's phone went off at 4:45 every morning. Not because he set it for that time. Because his body had learned, somewhere in the last 2 years, that rest was a thing other people got to have fully. He would lie there for a minute, maybe 2, staring at the water stain on the ceiling above his bed. A dark, spreading shape that looked different depending on the morning. Some days it looked like a map. Some days it looked like a question. On the worst days, it looked like nothing at all, which was somehow the hardest kind. Then he would hear Pia breathe through the thin wall between their rooms, one slow, steady breath, barely audible. And that was enough. He would get up. 4:45, every morning, including this one. The apartment at Fenwick Street was small in the way that forced intimacy with every object inside it. The kitchen was narrow enough that opening the oven door meant pressing yourself against the opposite counter. The bathroom had a shower head that ran cold for the first 4 minutes, which Luca had eventually stopped fighting and started using as a kind of discipline. The living room held a couch, a coffee table, a shelf of Pia's books stacked with the careful pride of a child who had been told from birth that these mattered, and a single armchair by the window where Luca sometimes sat at night after Pia was asleep. Not reading, not watching anything, just sitting in the specific silence of a person whose thoughts were too loud and too quiet at the same time. The walls were painted a pale yellow that had been cheerful once. Now it was just there, doing its job. He had not hung anything on them when they moved in. That had felt too much like deciding to stay. He made coffee in the machine with the cracked handle, a Krups he'd bought second-hand from a neighbor who was moving, a machine that wheezed and shuddered every morning like it too, was dragging itself back from somewhere difficult. While it ran, he laid out Pia's uniform on the kitchen chair. Navy skirt, white blouse, the gray cardigan with the small butterfly button she'd chosen herself at the Goodwill on Orchard Street, and loved with a devotion he found both heartbreaking and clarifying. He checked her bag, homework folder, pencil case, the permission slip for the school trip he'd signed 3 days ago so he wouldn't forget. He put her water bottle in the side pocket and zipped it shut. He did all of this by muscle memory, in the almost dark, before the building woke up. That was Luca's morning. That was every morning. He'd started at Hartwell Distribution 18 months ago, 2 weeks after moving to Fenwick Street, 1 week after Pia's first day at PS 61. The warehouse was 3 miles east, the kind of industrial building that existed in a part of the city people drove past without looking at. Low-slung, concrete, or surrounded by a chain-link fence with a sign that read, "No tailgating," in letters faded to near illegibility. He worked the early shift, 5 to 2, loading and sorting pallets for the regional delivery routes that fanned out across the city each morning. It was physical work. Luca didn't mind physical work. Physical work asked nothing of him emotionally, which had been exactly what he needed when he'd walked in and filled out the application with hands that still weren't quite steady. His supervisor was a compact, no-nonsense man named Bert, who communicated primarily in nods and clipboard gestures, and had once, in 18 months, told Luca he was doing a good job. Luca had thought about that for 3 days afterward. Not because he needed the praise, because he'd been surprised to realize how long it had been since anyone had said anything like that to him at all. He made $22 an hour. After taxes, after the bus pass, after the school lunch account and the phone bill and the rent, which had gone up $60 in September without apology. He had, on a good month, a little under $300 left over. He kept it in an envelope in the kitchen drawer, under the takeout menus he never used. He was saving for a bicycle. Not for himself, for Pia. She'd mentioned it once, casually, the way children mention things they've already decided they'll never get. That kids at school rode their bikes to the park on weekends, and that she thought it looked fun. She hadn't mentioned it again. That was the part that stayed with him, that she'd already learned, or at 8 years old, not to repeat things she wanted. He would get her the bicycle. He just needed 2 more months. On the Tuesday morning that mattered, the one that set everything in motion, though Luca would not understand that until much later. He left the apartment at 5:20 and walked to the bus stop on the corner of Fenwick and Calder. The air was cold and thin, the kind that gets into the joints and reminds them of their age. The street was empty except for a man walking a dog and a delivery truck idling outside the deli 2 blocks up. Luca stood at the bus stop with his collar up and his hands in his pockets and watched the sky at the far end of the street turn from black to the particular deep blue that exists only in that window between night and morning, or when the city hasn't decided yet what kind of day it's going to be. He thought about Pia's parent-teacher conference, scheduled for Thursday. He thought about the permission slip. He thought about the bicycle. Then, the way the mind moves at 5 in the morning when the defenses are still drowsy. He thought about Julia. He didn't mean to. He almost never meant to. Julia had been his wife for 6 years, and his whole world for 9. She had left on a Wednesday in January, 3 years ago, quietly and completely, the way people leave when they've been making the decision for a long time before they say it out loud. She hadn't been cruel. That was the thing about Julia. She was never cruel. She'd sat across from him at the kitchen table of their old apartment, the bigger one, the one with the proper hallway, and told him that she loved him, but that loving him had started to feel like disappearing. He hadn't known what to say to that. He still didn't. She called Pia every Sunday. She sent birthday cards with money inside. She was a good mother from a distance. Luca didn't speak badly of her. Not ever. Not even on the nights when Pia asked why Mama didn't live with them, and Luca had to find words that were both honest and bearable. He was good at that now, finding words that fit in the space between true and too much. The bus arrived at 5:29. He got on. He found a seat by the window. He watched Fenwick Street disappear behind him. He did not look back. That was also something he had gotten very good at. She didn't belong on Fenwick Street, and everyone knew it before she'd even reached the 2nd block. It was a Thursday, or just after 2 in the afternoon. Luca had clocked out of Hartwell early, a rare thing, a gift from Bert, who'd told him the afternoon pallets were covered and to go home before the weather turned. The sky above the city had that pressed tin look that comes before serious rain, the clouds low and moving fast, the air carrying that particular metallic smell that means it isn't coming. It's already decided. He was half a block from the building when he saw her. She was standing at the corner of Fenwick and Calder, just outside the entrance to Polly's Convenience, and she was looking at the building's intercom panel with the focused, slightly perplexed expression of someone navigating a system that was beneath what they were used to. She was wearing a camel-colored wool coat, the kind of coat that didn't have a brand name on the outside because it didn't need one, the kind whose quality announced itself in the way it fell and moved. Her hair was dark, pulled back simply. She had no umbrella. She had no shopping bag. She had nothing in her hands at all except her phone, which she was holding without looking at. The way people hold phones when they're thinking about something the phone can't help with. She was perhaps 40, perhaps 45. She had the kind of face that had been beautiful for so long, it had simply become something else. Something more useful than beautiful. Composed. Precise. A face that had learned to give nothing away. What she was doing on Fenwick Street, Luca had absolutely no idea. He watched her press the intercom button for apartment 2C, where she waited. Nothing. Pressed it again. Still nothing. She stepped back slightly, looking up at the building's facade with an expression that might have been calculation or might have been something more private. Something she quickly rearranged when she sensed movement nearby. She turned. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Then the sky opened up. It came down all at once, the way it sometimes does in this city, without the usual warning of a drizzle first. Just suddenly, completely, sheets of cold rain hammering the pavement and bouncing back up in a fine gray mist. The woman made a small, involuntary sound and stepped back against the wall of Paulie's, but the awning was narrow and useless, and within seconds her coat was darkening at the shoulders, and the rain was running off her hair in thin streams. Luca crossed the street without thinking about it. "Here," he said, already holding his jacket above her like a makeshift roof. It was a reflex. He didn't calculate it. He didn't weigh it. He just did it the way he always did things for people who needed something, without making it a moment, without expecting it to be noticed. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read immediately. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was low, controlled, the voice of a woman who was used to being in charge of rooms. "You're soaked," Luca said, not unkindly. "There's an overhang on the other side of the door. It's wider. Barely, but it helps." She looked at him for another half-second. Then, without a word, she moved with him to the building's entrance, where the concrete overhang extended another 4 feet and actually kept the rain off. Luca unlocked the front door and held it open. "You can wait inside the lobby," he said. "It's not much, but it's dry." She hesitated. That hesitation was interesting. Not suspicious, exactly, but careful. The hesitation of a person who had learned to assess things before accepting them. "I'm trying to reach someone in 2C, she said. "A man named Petrov. I have an appointment." "Petrov's been out since Monday," Luca said. "His brother's sick. He mentioned it to the super. Might be another week." Something moved across her face. Not distress, something more managed than that. Inconvenience filtered through composure. "I see," she said. "You can try calling him," Luca offered. "Or wait out the rain, at least." She stepped into the lobby. Luca followed, shaking the water off his jacket in the doorway. But the lobby was exactly what it was, narrow, lit by a single fluorescent tube that buzzed faintly on the left side, mailboxes along one wall, a notice board with a flyer for a lost cat that had been there since August. The floor was linoleum, clean, but irreversibly dull. The woman stood slightly to one side, looking at her phone. Her coat was dark across the back now, rain-heavy. She didn't seem to know what to do with her hands, which was the first human thing about her. "Luca," he said, not as an introduction exactly, just to fill the space. She looked up. "Sorry?" "My name. Luca. I live on the 4th floor." A pause. Then, with the careful politeness of someone who wasn't sure yet if this mattered, "Renata." That was all she gave. Just Renata. He didn't push for more. He checked his watch. He needed to leave in 40 minutes to get Pia. But he leaned against the wall across from the mailboxes and looked at the rain through the small window beside the door, giving her the room to be uncomfortable without performing it. "Is there a coffee place nearby?" she asked after a minute. "Somewhere I could wait?" "There's the diner on Calder, 3 blocks down, left side. It's nothing special, but it's warm and they'll leave you alone." She nodded. She was looking at her phone again, but he could tell she wasn't reading anything. "The rain should break in about 20 minutes, he said. "Usually does when it comes down that fast." She glanced up. "You track the weather?" I walk everywhere, he said simply. You learn to pay attention. She looked at him then, really looked for the first time. On the way people look when they've been dealing with someone as a situation and have just noticed there's a person inside it. It lasted only a moment. Then she looked back at her phone. The lobby door opened and Dino from 3A came in, wrestling with a collapsed umbrella and swearing under his breath in 2 languages. He stopped when he saw the woman. His eyes went up and down her coat, quickly, the way men do when they think they're being subtle. And then he looked at Luca, with an expression that was somehow both conspiratorial and skeptical. Luca? He nodded at the woman. Who's your friend? Neighbor of Petrov's, Luca said. Waiting out the rain. Dino made a sound that was almost a laugh. He leaned slightly toward Luca, lowering his voice in the way people do when they want to be overheard. Women like that don't wait out rain on Fenwick Street, Luca. They have people for that. He said it like it was a joke. It wasn't entirely a joke. Luca said nothing. Renata, to her credit, did not react visibly, but her chin lifted a fraction. Just a fraction. Luca caught it. Dino disappeared up the stairs, still working at the umbrella. The lobby was quiet again. I'm sorry about that, Luca said. Don't be, she said. Her voice was even. He's not wrong. Luca looked at her. Doesn't mean he needed to say it. She met his eyes again. Something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but rearranging, like furniture moved an inch. Then she looked away, out the window. The rain was already beginning to ease, just as he'd said. You really do pay attention, she said quietly. To herself as much as to him. You learn to, he said again, when it matters. She didn't reply. She put her phone in her coat pocket and stood a little straighter, the way people do when they're about to leave. The diner on Calder, she said. Left side, he confirmed. She walked out into the rain, which had pulled back to a thin drizzle, and didn't look back. Luca watched her until she turned the corner. Then he went upstairs to make Pia's afternoon snack, thinking about nothing in particular, which was another way of thinking about something he wasn't ready to name. He didn't expect to see her again. That was the honest truth of it. Fenwick Street was not the kind of place people returned to by choice. You came here because you needed something. Cheap rent, proximity to the bus line, a fresh start that the city's nicer neighborhoods couldn't afford you. You didn't come back for atmosphere. You certainly didn't come back if you had a car and a coat like hers. So when Luca came down the stairs on Saturday morning, Pia's hand in his, heading out to the farmer's market on Delancey, that they did every week when his legs had recovered enough from the workdays to make the walk feel like pleasure rather than punishment, when he pushed open the lobby door and found Renata standing on the front step, he stopped. She was looking at her phone. She was wearing different clothes but the same quality. Dark trousers, a charcoal sweater, a leather bag over one shoulder. She looked up when the door opened. If she was surprised to see him, she didn't let it reach her face. Petrov's still out, Luca said. I know, she said. I called him. A pause. So you're... I was in the neighborhood. She said it in a way that closed the subject, firmly and without hostility, the way people close doors they've decided not to explain. Pia, who had no patience for gaps in conversation, tugged Luca's hand and looked up at the woman with the direct, unself-conscious curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that staring was complicated. You have very nice shoes, Pia said. Renata looked down. She was wearing ankle boots, dark leather, simple. But Pia had an instinct for these things that Luca had never been able to account for. She had her mother's eye. Something in Renata's face shifted. Not a smile exactly, more like the beginning of one that she caught and held back. "Thank you," she said. Her voice, directed at Pia, was softer than the voice she used with Luca. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. "I'm Pia," his daughter announced. "That's my dad. He walks too fast, but he lets me get one thing at the market so it evens out." Luca felt the particular brand of parental helplessness that comes from your child being exactly themselves at the exact wrong moment. "We should get moving," he said. "Enjoy your morning." He meant it politely. He meant it as a clean exit for both of them. But Renata said, "Which market?" And the question was so unexpected, from her in that tone, like she was actually asking, that he answered before he decided to. "Delancey, about a mile down." She nodded slowly, then, "I'll walk that way, if that's not strange." It was strange. They both knew it was strange. But Pia was already walking ahead, apparently having decided the matter, and Luca fell into step, and Renata fell into step beside him, and that was how it happened. Sideways, without announcement, the way most things that matter actually begin. She was not easy company. That was the thing he noticed first, and kept noticing. She didn't fill silence with noise the way most people did. She didn't ask comfortable questions. "What do you do? How long have you lived here? Do you know the area well?" She walked with her eyes moving, taking things in, the way someone does when they're used to assessing environments quickly. She responded when spoken to. She did not volunteer. Pia, unbothered, narrated the walk with the running commentary she applied to all their Saturday mornings. The dog outside the hardware store that she'd named Biscuit 3 weeks ago and greeted every time. Or the mural on the wall of the old laundromat that had a dolphin on it for no reason anyone had been able to explain. The crack in the pavement outside number 42 that looked exactly like Italy if you looked at it right. "It really does look like Italy," Renata said, looking down at the crack. Pia stopped walking and stared up at her. "You're the first person who's ever agreed with me. Your father doesn't see it?" "Dad says it looks like a sock." Renata glanced at Luca. "It does not look like a sock." Luca looked at the crack in the pavement. "It has a heel," he said, which made Pia dissolve into laughter and walk on ahead, satisfied. For a moment, the silence between them was a different kind of silence, less guarded, just a fraction. Then Renata looked straight ahead, and the moment folded itself away, and she was composed again. And they walked the rest of the way to Delancey without touching anything real. He saw her twice more that week. Once at the diner on Calder, where he'd stopped for coffee before the afternoon pickup, and found her at a corner table with a laptop and 3 empty cups, and the focused, slightly haggard look of someone who had been working through a problem for hours. He ordered his coffee at the counter and didn't approach her. She looked up, saw him, and nodded, the smallest possible acknowledgement, the kind that said, "I see you and don't make this a thing simultaneously." He nodded back. He took his coffee to go. The second time was Friday evening, outside the building. She was on the phone, standing by the intercom, and she had the voice on. The other voice, the one she didn't use with Pia, the one that was all precision and authority, and clipped and certain. She was telling someone that the quarterly projections were unacceptable, and that if the board couldn't see that, then the board needed to look harder. She said it without raising her voice. That was the thing about her. She didn't need volume. The certainty was the volume. She caught him watching and turned slightly away. He went inside. That night, after Pia was in bed, he sat in the armchair by the window and thought, with more honesty than he usually allowed himself, about what exactly he was doing. He wasn't doing anything, he told himself. She was a stranger. She was a stranger who was clearly in a different category of existence from him in every practical sense. The coat, the voice on the phone, the way she moved through spaces like she was used to spaces making room for her. Words, he was a man who tracked weather by walking. She probably had a meteorologist. He wasn't doing anything. He was just noticing. But noticing, he knew from experience, had its own kind of danger. He had noticed Julia across a room at a party 19 years ago and told himself he was just noticing. He knew how that went. He got up, checked the locks, and went to bed. The Saturday that changed things started normally. He and Pia were heading back from the market. She had chosen a small pot of mint, which she was carrying with both hands, and the solemnity of someone transporting something irreplaceable, when they saw Renata coming out of the diner on Calder. She had the laptop bag over one shoulder and a coffee in her hand, and she was moving with purpose, the way she always moved, like her time had coordinates. She stopped when she saw them. Pia looked up at her. Then, with no preamble whatsoever, "Why do you always look sad when you think no one's watching?" The question landed like something dropped. Luca said, "Pia." "I'm not being rude," Pia said calmly, which was something she said often, and which was always technically true and never entirely the point. "I just noticed. At the market last time you were watching the people with their families and you made a face, like how Dad looks at the bicycle in the shop window." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Renata looked at Pia for a long moment. Then she crouched down, slowly, deliberately, bringing herself to the child's level, and looked at her with an expression Luca had not seen on her before. Unguarded. Just for a second. Just long enough. "But you're very observant," Renata said quietly. "Dad says that too," Pia said. "He says it like it's a compliment, but sometimes I think it scares people." "It doesn't scare me," Renata said. Her voice was barely above a murmur. Pia considered this. Then she held out the mint plant with both hands. "You can smell it if you want. It helps when you're having a hard day. Dad taught me that." Renata looked at the small pot of mint. Then she leaned forward and breathed it in, slowly, her eyes closing for just a moment. And when she opened them again, there was something in her face that Luca had no word for yet. Something between recognition and grief, and the very first, cautious loosening of a thing that had been held tight for a very long time. She stood back up. She looked at Luca over Pia's head. He looked back at her, and neither of them said anything. There was nothing yet that could be said. But something had shifted in the particular way that shifts are most dangerous, quietly and without any way back. It was Renata who came to him this time, not to Petrov, not to the building for any reason she explained. She knocked on the door of apartment 4B on a Wednesday evening at 7:30, and when Luca opened it, she was standing in the hallway with a bottle of wine in one hand and the expression of a person who had rehearsed something and then decided against it at the last second. "Pia mentioned you make pasta from scratch," she said. "I told her that was unlikely." Luca looked at her. "She told you that?" "Last Saturday, while you were paying for the mint." A pause. "I thought I'd verify." He understood then that this wasn't really about pasta. He also understood that she needed it to be about pasta. at least to begin with. So he stepped aside and held the door open. "You're lucky," he said. I was about to start. Pia was doing homework at the kitchen table and reacted to Renata's arrival with the calm satisfaction of someone whose plan had worked. Luca had a feeling conversations had happened without him. He let it go. He washed his hands, set a second place at the counter without ceremony, and went back to the dough he'd been resting under a cloth for the past hour. Renata sat on the stool at the counter across from him and watched him work with an attention that was different from her usual manner. Less guarded, more genuinely curious. The way people look when they've wandered into something they didn't expect to find interesting, and are a little annoyed at themselves for it. "You actually do this," she said. "Every Wednesday," he said. "It's our thing." He nodded toward Pia without looking up. "She rolls the edges. Badly, but with commitment." Pia looked up from her worksheet. "I do it with character," she corrected, and went back to her work. Renata almost smiled, that almost smile again. He was starting to understand that this was as much as she gave in one sitting, these almost things, these fractional openings, and that pushing past them would close them entirely. He poured her a glass of the wine she'd brought without asking if she wanted one. She accepted it without comment. He worked the dough. She watched. The kitchen filled with the sound of Pia's pencil and the low simmer of the sauce on the back burner and the muffled noise of the building settling around them. All the ordinary sounds of an evening that had no reason to matter and was quietly mattering anyway. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Sure." She turned the wine glass slowly by the stem. "Why do you keep being kind to me? Not just—" She stopped, started again. "Most people want something when they're kind to someone like me. They want access, or a favor, or they want to say they know me. You don't seem to want any of those things." She was looking at the counter, not at him. "So I'm asking why." Luca was quiet for a moment. He pressed the heel of his hand into the dough, folded it, pressed again. The question didn't embarrass him. It just required an honest answer, which took a second to locate. "I don't think it's kindness exactly," he said finally. "I think it's just paying attention, seeing what's in front of me and responding to it." He paused. "You were wet, and the door was right there. That's all that was." "That's not all that was," she said quietly. He looked up at her. "No," he admitted. "It's not." She met his eyes, then looked away again. The wine glass turned slowly. "Where I work," she said, and he could hear her deciding how much to say, how much to sand down. "People are very kind to me. Constantly, elaborately. Every gesture is a transaction. Every door held open is a debt being created." She stopped. "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've gotten very good at knowing the difference between kindness and investment." A breath. "You confuse me." "Because I'm not investing?" "Because you seem genuinely unbothered by who I am." She said it without vanity, as a fact, and a puzzle. "You haven't asked me what I do. You haven't looked me up. I know you haven't because if you had, you'd have looked at me differently by now. Everyone looks different afterward." "I figured you'd tell me what mattered when it mattered," he said simply. She looked at him then, the full look, the one she rarely gave, the one that felt like actually being seen by something with very clear vision. It lasted long enough that he felt it in his chest, just slightly. "My husband didn't want children," she said. It came out of nowhere, or from somewhere very deep that had decided to surface. That was the reason, in the end. Not the only reason, but the weight-bearing one. I wanted them. Well, he didn't. And I chose wrong, and then I couldn't unchoose. She said it with no self-pity, just the clean, flat exhaustion of a truth that had been carried a long time. When your daughter held that plant out to me, She stopped, pressed her lips together. It was a very small thing. I know it was a small thing. Small things are mostly what there is, Luca said. She looked at the counter again. Is that what keeps you going? The small things? He thought about 4:45 in the morning, about the school uniform laid out in the dark, about Pia's laugh at the sock-shaped crack in the pavement, about the particular quality of the silence in the apartment after she fell asleep, which was the only silence that had ever felt like enough. She keeps me going, he said. But everything else is just the things I do to deserve her. It was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in 2 years. He said it the way honest things should be said, without drama, without needing a response. Renata didn't give a response, not a verbal one. She was quiet for long enough that Pia looked up from her homework, glanced between the two adults with the unreadable assessment of a child who is tracking something she can't yet name, and then looked back down at her paper. Luca began cutting the dough into strips. The sauce on the back burner sent the smell of tomatoes and basil through the small kitchen, and outside the window the city made its city sounds, and the fluorescent tube above the counter threw its flat light across the scene, and none of it was beautiful in any postcard sense of the word. But there was something in the room that hadn't been there before. Some door, ajar that had not been ajar before. For what it's worth, Renata said quietly, almost to herself, you're doing a very good job with her. Luca kept cutting. He didn't trust himself to respond to that without his voice doing something he'd regret. So instead he said, You want to learn how to roll the edges? And the offer was so practical and so unexpected that Renata blinked once and then said, I'm sure I'll be terrible at it. And Luca said, That's fine. Pia does it with character. From the table, without looking up, Pia said, I heard that. And then Renata laughed. Not the almost laugh, not the fraction. A real one, sudden and unguarded. And Luca looked up at the sound of it, and found her with her hand over her mouth, and her eyes bright, and her whole composed, careful face rearranged into something that was just a person, just a woman, laughing in a small kitchen on a Wednesday night. He looked back down at the dough before she could see what that did to him. But it was already too late. And he already knew it. She stopped coming on a Thursday. Luca noticed on Friday, which told him more than he wanted to know about himself. It wasn't as though they had a schedule. Nothing had been arranged. There was no standing invitation, no agreed-upon day. What there had been, in the 2.5 weeks since the Wednesday pasta dinner, was a pattern, the irregular, unspoken kind that assembles itself out of repeated choices and eventually starts to feel like structure. She would appear on Fenwick Street 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with a purpose, the diner, her continued dealings with Petrov, which Luca had stopped questioning, and sometimes with no stated reason at all. They would talk in the lobby, or on the front step, or occasionally at the diner on Calder when Luca stopped in for coffee after drop-off, and found her already there. Once, on a Sunday, she had joined him and Pia for the walk to the market again, and this time hadn't even constructed a reason for it. He had not kissed her. He had not tried to. That was not what this was. Not yet, not defined, not named. It was something more careful than that and more fragile, built out of Wednesday kitchens and mint plants, and a laugh that had broken through without permission. He was not under any illusion about the distance between their lives. He was also not, any longer, entirely convinced that distance was fixed. Then Thursday came, and she wasn't there. And Friday. And Saturday. He didn't go to the diner. He told himself it was because he had laundry and groceries and Pia's weekend homework to supervise. He told himself this while walking past the diner on the way to the laundromat and not going in. By Sunday, he had stopped explaining himself and was just sitting with it. The specific discomfort of caring about someone's absence when you have no standing to ask about it. They hadn't exchanged numbers. That had seemed right at the time, in the way that not pushing had always seemed right with her. Now it seemed like a structural flaw he should have seen coming. But he sat in the armchair by the window on Sunday night after Pia was asleep, and did the thing he'd been refusing to do all week. He thought about it honestly. He thought about how he had started timing his arrivals home differently, leaving a few minutes of margin in case she was outside. He thought about how he had told Pia, casually, that Renata might stop by sometime, and Pia had said, "I know," with the confidence of someone who had already arranged it. He thought about the way Renata had looked in his kitchen. Not comfortable, exactly, not relaxed in the way that came from ease, but settled, in the way that comes from effort, from choosing to be somewhere despite the fact that it costs you something. He thought about what she'd said about kindness being indistinguishable from investment. He wondered if she had decided he was one or the other, and which way she'd landed. He went to bed without resolution, which was the only honest outcome. On Monday, Dino knocked on his door. Luca opened it to find his neighbor holding a manila envelope and wearing the expression of a man trying to decide how much trouble he is in. "This came to my box by mistake," Dino said, holding out the envelope. "Saturday, I didn't open it." Luca took it. His name was on the front, handwritten, in ink. Just Luca, no surname, no address. The return corner of the envelope was blank. "It was in your box?" Luca asked. Dino shifted his weight. "Mine. Wrong slot. 48 and 49 look the same if you're not paying attention." He paused. "I didn't read it." "You said that already." "I'm saying it twice so you believe me." Luca closed the door and stood in the hallway with the envelope. He didn't open it immediately. He put it on the kitchen counter and finished making Pia's breakfast, and walked her to school, and came back and stood in front of it again for a full minute before sitting down. Inside was a single sheet of paper, cream-colored, heavy stock. Not a letter, exactly. More like a note, written in the same precise hand as the name on the envelope. "I owe you an explanation, and I am not yet ready to give you the real one. What I can tell you is that I had to leave suddenly, not because of anything that happened here, but because of something that was already moving before I arrived. I may not be able to come back for a while. I don't know yet. I am not good at this. I want to be clear about that, so you don't mistake my difficulty for indifference. They are not the same thing, though I have spent a long time letting people confuse them. Tell Pia the mint should be watered every other day, not more. It will drown." Or Luca read it twice. Then he set it on the counter and looked at it. Outside, a truck backed up on Fenwick Street making its reversing sound, and upstairs someone walked across a room in heavy shoes, and the building made its usual noises, and everything was exactly as ordinary as it always was. He thought about the phrase, "something that was already moving before I arrived." He turned it over. It had the quality of a sentence that had been edited down from something longer, something more specific, and he didn't know if that was legal language or personal language or both, and not knowing was its own particular weight. He thought about, I am not good at this. He believed that. He had watched her be not good at it. The almost smiles, the careful exits, the way she held space in a conversation without ever quite filling it. He had found it recognizable in the specific way that things are recognizable when you've done them yourself. He had been not good at this for 2 years. He was familiar with the shape of it. He folded the note and put it in the kitchen drawer under the takeout menus, next to the envelope of money for Pia's bicycle. That evening, while Pia watered the mint plant, every other day, not more, she looked up at him and said, Is Renata coming Wednesday? Not this week, Luca said. Pia considered this. Did something happen? She had to go somewhere. For work? I think so. Pia was quiet for a moment, holding the small watering can with both hands. Then she said, She'll come back, with the absolute conviction of an 8-year-old who had decided something was true and saw no reason to negotiate with doubt. Luca looked at his daughter. Yeah, he said, maybe. But that night, much later, he took the note back out of the drawer and read it one more time in the specific silence of the apartment after midnight. And the last line, "It will drown," sat in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with mint plants and everything to do with the particular fear of a person who has finally, carefully, let something back in. It was a Tuesday, 11 days after the note. Luca was in the lobby checking the mail, an act that had become, without him consciously deciding it, something he did twice a day instead of once. Not because he was expecting anything, or not only because of that. The mail rarely held anything worth finding. A bill, a circular for a pizza place, 2 neighborhoods over, the occasional piece addressed to a tenant who'd moved out a year ago and whose life was still finding its way here in envelopes. He was standing at the mailbox when the front door opened. 2 people walked in. A man and a woman, both in suits, both carrying leather document bags, both moving with the precise, calibrated efficiency of people who billed by the hour and felt it. The man was perhaps 50, silver at the temples, though with a face that had spent decades giving people news they weren't prepared for. The woman was younger, a tablet already open in her hands, a small wireless earpiece in her left ear. They stopped when they saw Luca. "Mr. Ferrante?" the man said. Luca closed the mailbox. "Yes." "My name is Aldrich Vane. I'm a senior partner at Vane Kellerman. We represent the estate of Renata Solis." He paused, in the way that people pause when they have learned that pausing before certain words allows the information to be received with appropriate gravity. "We'd like to speak with you, if you have a few minutes, somewhere private." Luca looked at them. He looked at the document bags. When he thought about the note in the kitchen drawer, and the phrase "something that was already moving," and the particular stillness that had lived in his chest for the past 11 days. "Upstairs," he said. He sat at the kitchen table. Aldrich Vane sat across from him. The younger associate stood to one side with her tablet, professional and essentially invisible in the way that good associates learn to be. The kitchen looked exactly as it always looked. The mint plant on the windowsill, Pia's drawings on the refrigerator, the cracked coffee machine, the worn edges of the table where the laminate had started to lift in one corner. Luca was aware of all of it in the heightened way that ordinary things become visible in extraordinary moments. "Is she dead?" Luca said. He said it plainly because he needed to know before anything else. Aldrich Vane shook his head. No, she's alive. She's recovering. A careful word. Ms. Solis had a cardiac episode 11 days ago. She was admitted to Cedar Vale Medical. She asked us to come to you as soon as she was stable enough to sign the relevant documents. Luca said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. Mr. Ferrante, I think it's important that you understand the full context of why Ms. Solis was on Fenwick Street. Aldrich Vane folded his hands. Renata Solis is the founder and principal shareholder of Solis Capital Group. Her personal net worth, at last valuation, is approximately $2.4 billion. The kitchen was very quiet. Luca heard the mint plant do nothing. He heard the building settle. He heard his own breathing, which was steady, which surprised him. She wasn't here for Petrov, he said. Oh, no. A slight pause. She was here for you. She'd been conducting a kind of personal inquiry into people, into character. She does this periodically, has done for some years, in different forms. She presents as someone without resources, and she observes how she is treated. He paused again. It is, as I understand it, connected to certain experiences in her professional life. She has been deceived significantly, more than once, by people whose warmth was conditional on her wealth. She wanted to find something, some evidence that people existed who were simply— he seemed to search for the right word. Good, without agenda. Luca thought about the lobby in the rain, about holding his jacket over her head without calculating it, about Pia and the mint plant, and a laugh in a small kitchen, while he thought about how ordinary all of it had been. Just ordinary. She kept coming back, he said. It wasn't a question. That was not part of the original inquiry, Aldrich Vane said, and for the first time something that was almost warmth crossed his professional face. That, Mr. Ferrante, was entirely her own decision. The associate stepped forward and placed a sealed envelope on the table in front of Luca. Cream-colored, heavy stock. The same hand as before. Just Luca on the front. She asked that you read this privately, Aldrich Vane said, after we've explained the formal elements. The formal elements took 17 minutes. Luca listened. He heard the words, the trust established in his name, the figure, which was large enough that it took his mind several seconds to process it as a real number rather than an abstraction, or the conditions, which were almost none, the timeline, the account details. And he heard all of it from a slight distance, the way you hear things when the emotional register of a moment is so far beyond your normal range that the brain handles the information but doesn't yet know where to file it. When Aldrich Vane finished, he said, "Do you have questions?" Luca looked at the envelope on the table. "Not for you," he said. They left. He heard their footsteps on the stairs, the lobby door, and then the street. He sat at the table alone in the kitchen with the envelope in front of him for a long moment. Then he picked it up and opened it. Luca, I have tried to write this 4 times, and each version was too long because I kept trying to explain myself, and I have realized that explanations are a form of self-protection, and you deserve better than that from me. So here is what is true, in the order that it is true. I came to Fenwick Street because I was testing something. I have been testing people for years. I am not proud of this exactly, but I have been burned enough times that it became necessary. You were not supposed to be a person to me. You were supposed to be a data point. You held a jacket over my head in the rain without hesitating and without looking at me like you were doing something generous. You just did it. Like it was the only available response to a person being wet. I came back because I had not felt that in a very long time. something without a price on it. I came back after that because of Pia. I want to be honest with you about that. Your daughter looked at me on a street corner and asked me why I looked sad when no one was watching, and I have been asked many things by many sophisticated people, and none of them have ever gotten that close that fast. She sees clearly. That is your doing. Whatever you have been through, and I know enough to know it has been considerable, you have built someone extraordinary inside a small kitchen on not enough money, and that is not a small thing. That is one of the largest things I have ever witnessed. The money is real, and it is yours. My lawyers will explain the details. I don't want you to change your life dramatically. I want you to buy Pia the bicycle. I want you to fix the coffee machine. I want you to stop walking 3 miles to work in the cold because you cannot afford the bus fare and you won't ask anyone for help. I am not ready to ask you for anything. I don't yet know if I am capable of being someone who asks. But I want you to know that what happened in that kitchen on a Wednesday night, bad wine and pasta, and a child correcting both of us, was the first time in 4 years I have felt like a person who belonged somewhere. You gave me that, without knowing what I was, which was the only way it could have been real. Take care of the mint, and of yourself. Both require attention without drowning. Renata Luca sat with the letter for a long time. He read it once. Then he set it flat on the table with both hands pressed on top of it, or the way you hold something down when you're afraid of what it will do if it gets loose. Outside, Fenwick Street went about its business. A bus pulled away from the stop on Calder. Somewhere upstairs, Dino dropped something heavy and swore in 2 languages. The mint plant sat on the windowsill in the thin afternoon light, green and unremarkable and alive. Luca had to pick Pia up from school in 40 minutes. He still had to do that. That was still happening regardless of any of this. He still had to walk the 12 blocks to PS 61 and wait by the chain-link fence and watch the doors open and find her face in the crowd and be the thing she ran toward. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his chest pocket. Then he stood up, put on his jacket, and went to get his daughter. Pia was waiting at the fence when he arrived. She spotted him from 20 meters away and raised her hand in the particular wave she used when she was pleased with herself about something. Not the wide, frantic wave of a child wanting to be seen, but a small, deliberate one, almost a salute, as if she were confirming an appointment they'd both kept. She had that quality, his daughter. Ceremony and small gestures. He had no idea where she'd gotten it. Certainly not from him. He held the fence gate open, and she walked through it and fell into step beside him, the way she always did, immediately beginning to talk about the day with the momentum of someone who had been saving things up since lunch. The science project. The argument between 2 boys in her class about whether a platypus was technically a bird. Or the cheese sandwich she'd traded with a girl named Octavia for half a bag of crackers, a transaction she seemed to regard as financially sound. Luca listened and said the right things and watched the pavement pass under their feet and felt the letter in his chest pocket the entire way home. He did not tell her. Not that evening. She was 8 years old, and the letter was too large and too complicated for a Tuesday. And besides, he didn't yet fully understand it himself. He needed to hold it a while longer, turn it over in the dark, make sure it was real before he handed any of it to anyone else. He made dinner. Scrambled eggs and toast, the quick weeknight version, the one Pia called emergency breakfast with affection rather than complaint, where they ate at the kitchen table, and she read to him from the elephant book. She'd started again from the beginning, for reasons she had not explained, and the apartment was exactly what it had always been, lit the same way, smelling the same, the refrigerator making its small mechanical complaints, the city outside the window going about its enormous, indifferent business. After she was asleep, Luca sat in the armchair and took the letter out of his chest pocket and read it again. He read it slowly this time. Not the way he'd read it at the table, with his hands pressing it flat like he was afraid of it, but the way you read something when you've already survived the first impact and can now attend to what it's actually saying. You were not supposed to be a person to me. You were supposed to be a data point. He thought about that, and he thought about all the versions of the story he could construct from it. The one where he felt used, tested, assessed, evaluated like a specimen. He held that version up and examined it, and then set it down. It didn't hold. Not when he remembered the look on her face when Pia held out the mint plant. Not when he remembered the laugh breaking through. Not when he considered that a woman who had merely been collecting data does not come back to a small kitchen on a Wednesday night to roll pasta badly and stay 2 hours longer than she'd planned. You don't stay for data. You stay because you found something you don't want to leave yet. He knew that. He also knew grief when it was living in his chest. And it was there, a low, certain weight. Not for what had been lost exactly, because nothing had been lost. She was alive. She had written to him. She had said things in that letter that people don't say unless they mean them. But grief for the version of it that could have been simpler. Grief for the Wednesday evenings that had been interrupted. For the 11 days of not knowing and interpreting her absence as rejection when it had been a hospital bed. For every guarded moment between them that had cost them time and might now cost them more. He had done this before, loved cautiously and still lost. He knew the terrain. But he also knew, sitting in that armchair, in that apartment, with his daughter asleep behind the thin wall and the mint plant on the windowsill and the city outside making its city sounds, that the letter in his hands was not a door closing. It was one opening. He needed to decide what to do with that. In the morning, he called Aldrich Vane's office. The associate answered. He gave his name. Aldrich Vane was on the line inside 2 minutes. Mr. Ferrante, do you have questions about the documentation? No, Luca said. I want to know which hospital. A pause. Brief, professional. Mr. Ferrante, Ms. Solis asked that we not... I'm not going to show up unannounced, Luca said. I just want to send something. I need an address. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, Cedarvale Medical, the private wing, room 412. I'd ask that you keep that information. I know, Luca said. Thank you. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the mint plant. Then he went to the drawer, the one under the takeout menus, and took out the envelope with Pia's bicycle money. He counted it. He'd been 2 months away. He put it back, but he didn't need 2 more months anymore. He thought about that carefully, standing in the kitchen, because this was the moment he'd heard about in stories and never trusted. The moment where a man's circumstances change and he's supposed to feel free, released, reborn. He waited to feel that. He checked for it honestly. What he felt instead was responsibility, a different shape of it than before, larger in scale but not different in nature. The weight of it was familiar. He was not afraid of weight. He thought about what he would not do. He would not quit Hartwell immediately, because Bert had covered for him twice this month, and deserting without notice was not who he was. He would give 2 weeks, properly. He would not move Pia from PS61 mid-year because she had finally found her footing there, or because Otavia and the cracker trade and Mrs. Patterson's wall were part of a world she'd built, and that world belonged to her. He would not tell anyone, not Dino, not Carla at the cafe where he sometimes stopped, not his sister in Palermo who called once a month and always asked if he was managing. Not yet. Aldrich Vane's caution had not been decorative. What he would do, the first thing, the thing that needed doing now, today, was this. He cut a small sprig from the mint plant. He wrapped the base in a damp paper towel, and then in foil the way his mother had taught him to transport cuttings when he was small. He put it in a brown paper bag from the market. He wrote a note, not long, not eloquent, just 3 lines in his ordinary handwriting on a piece of paper torn from the notepad by the phone. You said attention without drowning. Working on it. So should you. The mint is a cutting, for your window, wherever that is. Luca. He folded it and put it in the bag. He dropped Pia at school at 8:15. She walked through the gates without looking back, already absorbed in something she'd spotted ahead, already entirely at home in her own small life. Luca watched until she disappeared into the building. Then he walked to the bus stop on the corner of Fenwick and Calder. He looked at the timetable. The 34 went to Cedarvale Medical. He had not taken it before. He checked the time. He had 2 hours before his shift. He had enough. He got on the bus with the brown paper bag in his hands, and he rode it across the city, watching the neighborhoods change through the window, from Fenwick's worn edges to the wider streets, the cleaner facades. They're the parts of the city that had been maintained. And he felt the letter in his chest pocket, and thought about a woman in a room 4 floors up in a building he'd never been inside, who had come to his street looking for evidence that goodness existed, and had apparently found it in a man holding a jacket over her head in the rain. He thought, I hope she's right about me. Then he thought, I'll try to be. The bus pulled up outside Cedarvale Medical, and the doors opened, and Luca Ferrante, single father of 1, warehouse worker of Fenwick Street, stood up and walked out into the morning with a small brown bag and no plan beyond the next right thing, which had always been, in the end, the only plan he'd ever really had.